I'm Una Kearse from Killaloe. I got my love of local heritage and history from my father, Sean Kearse. Our waterside heritage in the scenic twin towns of Killaloe and Ballina on the River Shannon just below Lough Derg is fascinating. I'm standing on the Riverside Walk in Ballina looking across at Killaloe, County Clare, and behind me is our bridge linking Ballina, County Tipperary with Killaloe, County Clare. It's an 18th century bridge built in the early 1700s. But it's not the only bridge that we ever had in Killaloe, and the annals mention several bridges throughout the years, even going back as far as Turlough, St. Flannan's time. It mentions Turlough on his way to Lismore bounding over the bridge at the city of Killaloe. So that's back in the 800s, but the story wasn't recorded until the 1200s. You'll also notice a metal section there on the bridge and the squared arch section. That section is relatively new. It was inserted in 1929 during the Shannon scheme. It's possible to raise that metal section, but it was only ever raised once, and that was to test it. The purpose of it was to facilitate boats with masts passing under the bridge. The river here at Killaloe would have looked very different until the 1800s. The first major change was the opening of this canal here in 1799. Prior to that, the river wasn't navigable between here and Limerick, and this canal was built to bypass rapids and weirs which interfered with the navigation. The river would also have looked very different. The river was a lot narrower and shallower and quite noisy. A very knowledgeable man on the Shannon waterways is Brian J. Goggin. He met us recently in Killaloe between the waters.
Right, we're sitting here on the bank of the Limerick Navigation, which was a canal and river linking Limerick with Killaloe. Most of the Shannon could be navigated relatively easily by boats even in the 18th century. They had to sail across the lakes and get rowed or poled on the river sections. But between Killaloe and Limerick, the Shannon drops 100 feet in a distance of 12 Irish miles. That's 15 statute miles. Because an Irish mile is bigger than a statute mile, of course. Roughly that's 24 kilometres in today's money. And in the second half of the 18th century, Limerick was particularly well represented in Parliament in Dublin, and therefore particularly well placed to get funding for public works, which in this case was the construction of a navigation between Limerick and Killaloe. And that navigation would enable traffic to get through when it otherwise couldn't get past the falls of Dunas and the other scenic but impassable sections of the river. The people constructing the navigation made a big mistake, which is that rather than make the whole thing a single canal from end to end, they did it in 2 river sections and 3 canal sections. So you had a canal section at the bottom in Limerick from what is now called the Park Canal, the Canal Harbour. From there, the navigation came into the river up as far as Plassey, where the university is now, and crossed the river into a second, the longest canal section up as far as Erina. From Erina, it was back into the river, up through O'Brien's Bridge, and to a place a couple of miles down from here, and that was where they started the third section of canal, which is this section here, running up through Killaloe. There were 3 locks on this section. The third of them is visible at the bridge itself, or at least the place where it was is still visible. What was formerly the lock keeper's house is now the library in Killaloe. Again, when they started, the sorts of boats that were used on this sort of navigation were fairly small by later standards, carrying between 5 and 10 tons, whereas 40 tons to 50 tons would have been the standard in later years. Entrepreneurs in Ireland were soon onto the game. The first steamboat on Irish inland waterways was built in Lough Neagh in about 1820. And in 1825, roughly, a man called John Grantham, who had been employed to survey the River Shannon, got the idea that a steamboat could do very well, could do good business on the River Shannon.
I'm here just off the bridge in Killaloe with Deborah Dudgeon. We're standing between the canal and the river. Today it's a busy place, it's a car park, there are a lot of water sports taking place, but back in the 1800s it was a thriving place because there were so many businesses here, so many people employed, and Deborah's going to talk to us particularly about the hotel business here in Killaloe and the impact it had.
Thank you, Una. Here where we're standing, we have what's left of the Royal Hotel in the background. This was established in 1829-1830 by the Dublin Limerick Steam Packet Company, and it was originally called the Ponsonby Arms. It was probably called that because Bishop Ponsonby was consecrated here in 1828 and he left in 1834. So it was the whole length of the cream building you can see there. The only original part left is the middle section where you can see the bay windows and the porch. So if you can imagine a building all that level, double hipped roof, and it served lords, ladies, all kinds of gentry, people coming fishing. So enjoying Killaloe and what it had to offer prior to the Shannon scheme, before all our fisheries disappeared.
Yes, and people came for a number of weeks at a time.
Oh,
and,
they
and
would.
spent quite a bit of time
yes,
here, didn't
they would. They'd come for, oh yeah, and the awful thing is, well, it isn't awful, I suppose, in the newspapers they talk about fashionable intelligence and they'd say, so much for GDPR, like that was out. They'd say, you know, so-and-so stayed here, they left on Tuesday or whatever, you know, so they were watching who was coming to stay. But also the coach from Limerick, the 12-passenger coach, you would stop here. So in 1840, the hotel was renamed as the Royal Hotel, and Mr. Gibbons leased it. And then in 1855, Sylvester Hurley took it over, and they were the last hoteliers to run it as a hotel through its life. And in 1865, Benjamin Guinness came, and he was an MP, he was the grandson of Arthur, and in order to greet him, the locals filled tar barrels along here and burnt them. In the newspaper articles, the guests talk about them standing at the bay windows, which you can see there, watching the revelries and the locals kind of, you know, lauding Benjamin Guinness. So he was obviously a famous person in their eyes. After Sylvester died, his wife Anne ran it, and then their daughter Frances. And then in 1905, John McKeough bought it, and he was a local auctioneer, and he'd already owned the grain store, which is just behind on Royal Parade there, and then he was to buy the Lakeside Hotel. So in 1916 to 1918, it was occupied by British forces.
The Sherwood Foresters.
The Sherwood Foresters, are they? Yeah. So then John McKeough moved back there while the Lakeside was being rebuilt.
Of course, the Royal Hotel wasn't the only hotel in Killaloe in the 1800s. It was built in the early 1800s, particularly to meet the needs of passengers on the canal. But in the second half of the 1800s, when Killaloe was a thriving town based on a tourist industry with fishing at its core, there were 6 or 7 hotels here, including the Shannon View Hotel, the Abbey View Hotel, the Kincora Hotel and others, to meet the needs of the tourists. Lots of those tourists came from the continent to Killaloe, often for a number of weeks at a time, and we have records of the fish they caught and how much they spent in various hotels. Killaloe became a thriving town largely because of the many enterprises of Dubliner Charles Y. Williams and his navigation companies, which were active from the 1820s on.
At the time we speak of, Williams bailed out Grantham. He also bought out another steamer that was operating here at the time. And again, with Killaloe as the headquarters, he began a programme of investment in Killaloe and in the whole area. Investment based around the water in different ways. One of the things he did was to build a hotel here, just up the way beyond the cathedral. He didn't operate it himself. He provided the financing and got somebody else in to run it. Shipping was his business, not running hotels. He invested in the Derry slate quarries over on the far side of the river, just up beyond Killaloe, or beyond Ballina, I should say. Again, slates would have provided a cargo for his steamers, or at least for the barges that the steamers towed. Williams's steamers were confined to carrying passengers. They towed the cargo carrying barges behind them. And you could load a cargo in Limerick onto a barge. It would be towed by horses up this navigation here, all the way up to here. At the pierhead, just up further beyond the bridge, the horses would stop towing and the steamer would start towing. So there'd be a change of towing method, if you like. But the cargo didn't have to be transshipped. The cargo stayed where it was. This cut down on costs. The steamer would then tow it up to Shannon Harbour, which is where the Grand Canal meets the River Shannon. Again, you'd have another change of tow at that point. The horses would take over again, tow the barge all the way to Dublin. And at that point, the cargo would be transshipped onto one of Williams's Irish Sea steamers, which would carry it to Liverpool. This whole endeavour was so extraordinary to the minds of people at the time that it was mentioned in Parliament on several occasions that a cargo of cattle, for example, had been loaded and had reached Liverpool in less than 3 days from the centre of Ireland. The Dublin to Limerick route was the best kept and therefore the fastest mail coach route in Ireland, with the astonishing average speed of 9.5 miles per hour. But the mail coach had some disadvantages. It was not very comfortable. It was very expensive. There were no loos on board, and you could stop for meals at some inns along the way, but the coach had to make its timetable, so you weren't given very much time for a meal either. So a number of people chose to take a road by water across Ireland as well, in one direction or another. It is said that Daniel O'Connell, when he wanted to go to Westminster, would travel from Kerry up to Tarbert by a steamer, then up the Shannon Estuary to Limerick, and then onto a horse-drawn passenger boat up this canal behind us as far as Killaloe. Here again he would change onto the steamer. The passengers travelled on the steamer and the cargo carrying barges were pulled behind, towed on as far as Shannon Harbour, and from there another horse-drawn boat would carry them to Dublin, where they would transfer to the steamer again. And this was the overall the most comfortable method of getting from the west of Ireland, the west coast of Ireland, to Dublin and then on to Liverpool, or in Daniel O'Connell's case on to London to give him what for in Westminster.
In 1832, Charles Y. Williams established the marble mill down here. It cost him £5,000. It's located here between the canal and the river. The main business was polishing and cutting marble and stone, making mantelpieces, flagstones for floors and more ornamental pieces.
Investments made by Charles Y. Williams in Killaloe also included the building here behind us. Now, marble in those days didn't necessarily mean quite what it meant today. Marble meant any stone that would take a polish. Williams used the difference in height between the canal here and the river out there to power a wheel inside the mill, which turned the polishing stones for the marble. The water flowed in here. That was the swing bridge, and inside the walls there's no longer any trace of it, but you could see the water course going through the yard and then into the building. And they constructed inside a small dry dock as well. Again, using the difference in height, you could put a boat in, let the water out through the mill, and then the boat would rest on the ground and you could do whatever repairs you wanted to do. The marble for the mill came from a number of sources. Some of it we know came from near Clonmacnoise. More of it came from Moneypoint, where the ESB now has a coal-fired power station.
In the field between the cathedral and the canal, we can see many objects associated with boating in the 19th century. There's a kind of dock which, as Brian explains, is called a patent slip.
A normal slip is simply a sloping ramp going into the water. You run a boat up at a high tide and wait for the tide to go out, or on non-tidal waters you haul it up somehow. With a patent slip, you wheel it up rails, you put the boat on sideways and winch it up to bring it out of the water. And that slip there was in use up to the 1960s. At least one boat was repaired on it in those days. It's not in very good repair at this time. But that was a little miniature boatyard there. You can see in there's a little miniature forge, and there were presses and all the things needed for woodwork and ironwork on repairing boats. One other feature is the crane closest to us here, which runs along rails. That was used for gauging boats. Now, after the City of Dublin Steam Packet Company had ceased to be the owner of the Limerick navigation, the whole navigation of the Shannon was united under the ownership of the Board of Works, of the Commissioners of Public Works. And they then were the navigation authority from then on, and they were entitled to charge boats for going through the locks. And they charged them by the amount of the weight of the cargo that they were carrying. But they didn't want to have to unload the cargo every time. So every boat was gauged so that you knew that if it had 30 tons, it would be down to this mark in the water. And if it was carrying 40 tons, it would be down to this mark. And if it was carrying 50 tons, it would be even further down in the water. And the gauging was done here by putting in weights to the appropriate amount, and then marking on the hull at the bow and stern the marks appropriate to those weights of goods. So when the boat entered on the Shannon navigation, it could then be charged the appropriate amount for the weight that it was carrying.
The pierhead here is where thousands of people emigrated from just after the famine. People came to Killaloe to emigrate because they could get a boat on the canal here to Limerick and a ship from Limerick to America. Or they could go up Lough Derg by boat and join the canals to Dublin, and from there emigrate to England or to Australia. The Inland Steam Navigation Company in the 1820s had their headquarters here at the pierhead, and these buildings here behind that wall are where their offices and headquarters were.
An interesting feature of the bridge in Killaloe is that it crosses a canal, a river and a railway. The railway is no longer there, unfortunately. Initially it didn't go under the bridge, but eventually it was given leave to go underneath the bridge and up to the station.
The railways came to Killaloe in 1862 and was an extension of the line from Burthill, a 5-kilometre extension. Along the Riverside Walk here in Ballina is where the railway track was laid. The original depot for the railway station was about a couple of 100 metres in front of me there at a wooden depot. But in the late 1860s, it was decided to further extend the railway line to the far side of the bridge, because a lot of the passengers coming to Killaloe were taking steamers up Lough Derg, and they had about a kilometre to manage between the point where they got off the train to where they'd get on the boat past where the Lakeside Hotel is today. When the railway line was extended, it cut off the route that ladies from Ballina had down to the river here for washing. And of course the ladies weren't very impressed and they complained but got nowhere. And then they decided they'd lay down across the railway tracks. And when they did that, they got this lovely little wooden and stone bridge. It's even today still known as the Washerwoman's Bridge. So the ladies could cross over the bridge, the train went underneath and through the arch on the far side. The Shannon Development Company was formed in the late 1800s to promote the use of the river and to promote especially tourism on the River Shannon. And they built the Lakeside Hotel, which is located on the other side of the river here behind me. The hotel opened at Easter in 1900. Day trips to Killaloe were popular back then. Tourists would come to Killaloe by train. The hotel often facilitated them with meals, breakfast, lunches, etc. And they would travel up Lough Derg by boat. In 1897, the Duke and Duchess of York, he later became King George V, they came to Killaloe by train and travelled between Killaloe and Banagher by boat. In the tourist literature for several years afterwards, that was known as the Duke of York route. You'll notice nets hanging on the metal section of a bridge here behind me. Between the months of October and March, the ESB trapped the eel to rescue them from damage or death passing through Ardnacrusha power station and the turbines. So they trapped the eel here and released them further down the river past Ardnacrusha.
The other feature of the waterside in Killaloe, the other industry we might say, is the eel fishery. You'll have seen by the bridge a yellow painted building of corrugated iron, and that's an eel packing shed. The bottom of that building is open to the river, and there are cages there where eels can be kept. Nowadays, because of the eel population has gone down so much, the eels are taken only in order to be transferred beyond the barrier of Ardnach, Russia. There's no commercial catch any longer. But as early as the 1850s, eels were being caught in Killaloe and kept in cages more or less in the same place, cages that the water could flow through. The eels were kept alive until the last minute. They were transported in water by train mostly and steamer on to Billingsgate, or in some cases perhaps even to the European markets. And that was a significant source of employment for people in Killaloe for a long time. The angling industry for salmon or trout obviously employed people as well as gillies and in the hotels.
When you come to Killaloe today, you can see so much evidence of former times, as well as a lot of modern day leisure activity, from stand-up paddling and canoeing to pleasure cruises and fishing trips. Our waterside is still bustling. Here is Aoife O'Mara.
So the canal, when it was built, it originally was used to bypass the rapids that were on the river. And nowadays, as we have Ardnach, Russia, we don't really need the canal. It's not used for commercial purposes. Instead, it's just really a few people going out on leisurely trips and tourism who really just use the canal. So it's nice and quiet all the time. My next venture is a guided kayaking tour company that operates out of Killaloe, and we provide tours of the canals and the River Shannon. We get a mix of locals, and we get a lot of people just travelling around Ireland. And basically what we do is we have kids who come out, kids as young as 4. And I think the oldest person we've taken out was maybe 86, I think. So mix of old and young, basically. But even locals aren't really sure, like they've never really been down here before. Like there's no really walkway down the canal. So to them it's kind of some people describe it as a jungle. But yeah, like it's a surprise. It's a nice way to end the trip. So we usually come up the canal from the bottom and we head up the canal then towards the end. So it's a nice way to end the trip. There's kingfishers, there's herons, there's a few otters as well, and there's also a turtle. So a bit of everything down here.
So Killaloe altogether is a town that has, over the years, derived a lot of its living from the Shannon, from being on the water. And more than anywhere else on the Shannon, it deserves the title of the capital of Ireland's inland waterways.